the Israeli statesman and former head of the Jewish agency, Avram Burg, no relation, said this of the ancient Israelite government: "The role of the prophet and man of spirit is to stand always at the side of the oppressed and downtrodden, the average citizen, and to defend him or her against an unjust regime. Our tradition understands that there is no government that is without injustice." Today, I want to talk to you about leadership. Perhaps elected leadership, but really leadership in general. And I want to explore the possibilities of leadership against the background of crisis. For this is the moment in which we find ourselves. We, the city, the state, the country, the world, are most certainly in crisis. I would not deign to compare myself to a prophet, but I would like to point out what Avram Burg is saying, that leaders, in all circumstances, not just moments of crisis, are flawed and fallible. That is why the Jewish tradition makes clear the leader is not divine, that he must sit with the Torah by his side and a prophet whispering in his ear, so as to be held accountable to a law greater than he, indeed greater than any human. Leaders fail. That is a given. In fact, our Parsha offers an interesting window into leadership and accountability. Whereas most of the time the Torah speaks about sin by using the conjunction im, if, as in if one sins. One time in our Parsha specifically, it uses the word asher conspicuously to refer to a nasi, a leader. Asher nasi yecheta, when, not if, a chieftain incurs guilt. Think about the greatest leaders in history, women and men who were victorious in war, who concretized new and better systems of government, who organized and caused the best and greatest social change. How many of them were not flawed? The question is not if a leader will sin. The question is asher, when the leader sins, what comes next? The most important thing from a Torah perspective, writes Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, is that a leader is sufficiently honest to admit his or her mistakes. Hence, the significance of the sin offering. That is quite clearly not the leader that we have in the White House right now. What, sadly, tragically, we do have is someone incapable of remorse, empathy, and self-reflection. What we have is someone whose hubris is so profound as to have done far too little to mitigate the catastrophe that has befallen our nation, who traffics in lies and conspiracy theories, who defunds research and denies basic scientific truths. The irony is that Donald Trump came to power by pretending that the world was much awfuler than it actually was. Now, when it is indeed awful, he chooses this moment of all moments to pretend that it is better than it seems. I would love to have the country opened up and just raring to go by Easter, he said. As one coronavirus consultant to the White House put it to conservative author and former presidential advisor Pete Wenner, he has chosen to imagine the worst is behind us when the worst is clearly ahead of us. Of course, the consequences for optimism in this moment are severe. People will hear, they will think it's okay to see their older relatives, their co-workers, their friends, and more people will get sick. And in this nation, which now claims the dubious distinction of highest number of diagnosed COVID-19 cases, more people, yes, will die. Leaders who fail and then compound their failures by failing to recognize those failures have blood on their hands. But I am telling you much of what I suspect you already know. And Shabbat is hardly the time to focus only on failure and certainly not on despair. It's supposed to be me'en olam haba, a taste of the world to come. And when olam hazeh, this world, feels broken and burning and without recourse, Shabbat is meant to help us discover love and kindness and even salvation. And what kind of leader would I be if I could only spew negativity and even justifiable anger? So instead, I want to highlight 3 stories of heroic leadership, rabbinic leadership even, as a way of underscoring how Judaism is fully capable of abiding meaningful adaptation in the face of extraordinary challenges. I'll start with an example from last week, from my own teacher, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, the rector of my alma mater, the American Jewish University, and chair of the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. Rabbi Dorff and his co-chair, Rabbi Pamela Barmash, issued last week a gzerah, a decree for the Shat HaDachak, this time of duress in which we currently find ourselves. Whereas in the past it was understood that a minyan could be only constituted by having 10 adult Jews physically present, Rabbis Dorff and Barmash during this crisis permit a minyan, especially for mourners, Kaddish, to be said even with only a virtual quorum. Now this may seem like a small thing, but it is not. The power of in-person analog community is a fundament of Jewish living, and one which this rabbi holds incredibly dear. And last week, when we were struggling with the question of how we keep people safe by following public health safety protocols and also honoring those who yearn to commemorate their loved ones through the Kaddish prayer, I was deeply moved and greatly relieved to learn that I did not have to choose. That is courageous leadership, to recognize that psychological health, that communal expressions of memory are not insignificant in the face of global pandemic. Indeed, they are even more important. Loneliness is real. Isolation is real. My rabbinic colleagues and I are providing more pastoral care than perhaps at any time in our careers right now. Social distancing comes at a real cost, and true leaders don't try to minimize that cost or try to wish it away. They mitigate the damage by finding creative and compassionate approaches to connection and healing. Which brings me to my second example. One of courageous rabbinic leadership from over 170 years ago. In 1848, there was a different terrible plague, the cholera epidemic of that year. A young rabbi named Yisrael Salanter bucked normative halachic guidelines in Lithuania to model radical life-saving behavior. Famously, he insisted that everyone eat every day and including on Yom Kippur, even going so far as to make kiddush on the bima during Kol Nidre services. As Rabbi David Rosen, the former chief rabbi of Ireland and director of the American Jewish Committee's Department of Interreligious Affairs, has written, Rav Yisrael Salanter was at the time a brilliant scholar, but also very young, 38 years old. Vilna was home to great, respected, and elderly rabbinical authorities. He blatantly went against many in their presence. He put up a 1,500-bed hospital with no financial resources and put 60 to 70 Kollel students to work with the sick, all returned unharmed. He ordered them to behave exactly the same on Shabbat as on weekdays. And in so doing, he ignored opinions of respected rabbis. Now, Rabbi Salanter would go on to form what is known as the modern Musar movement, the basis for the Inside Out Wisdom and Action cohorts that I'll be leading with 19 students this coming week. Rabbi Rosen asks about Salanter. Did the cholera epidemic exhibit his idiosyncratic emotional genius, propel him into public awareness, or actually mold his personality? What is clear is that no one today mentions the great rabbis who opposed this 38-year-old. And what does this have to do, my friends, with this current moment? He writes, I have no disrespectful word for those elderly and respected rabbinical scholars keeping some yeshivot open today. They are treading in the footsteps of the elderly rabbis of Vilna, who were terribly, terribly wrong. Which brings me to my third example, that of current Orthodox authorities who are speaking out in incredibly courageous ways. Not just the many Orthodox rabbis, many Orthodox rabbis of all levels of religious stringency who have criticized and condemned those who continue to gather for weddings, funerals, and the like. But in particular, those who have pushed the boundaries of halakha, much like Rabbi Salanter in his day, to preserve safety and to slow the march of this insidious virus, while preserving the best of Jewish living. One is a friend of mine, Rabbi Asher Lopatin, formerly the head of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, who is permitting followers to use Zoom or similar platforms for Seder on the second night. Now, that is not an easy thing for an Orthodox rabbi to say, mind you, but Rabbi Lopatin is able to tap into the status of Yontif Sheni, the second day of Hag, which is considered a less stringent rabbinical prohibition. But even in Israel, where they observe only one night for Seder, a prominent group of Sephardi Orthodox rabbis has just this week issued a ruling that permits video conferencing technology for Seder in Orthodox households. Passover is a special holiday, they write. It would also seem that the young children of Israel, were it not for their connection to their grandfather and grandmother, would not gather around the Seder table, and only the connection to the grandparent causes them to take part in the mitzvah of the Haggadah, reading and eating matzah. And in this generation, it is very important that children pay attention to their elders. I will say, just on behalf of the many Israeli parents who may not be as religious as these rabbis would prefer, there are a lot of parents, and not just grandparents, who do a good job of this, but their point is well taken. Grandparents play an important role in the education of their grandchildren, and kol hakavod to them for recognizing that. But this emergency decree is not simply for the sake of the children. It's also, they say, for the older folks too. These rabbis wish to, quote, remove sadness from adults and the elderly, to give them motivation to continue fighting for their lives and to prevent them from succumbing to depression, which might cause them to despair of life, end quote. The Torah tells us, with regard to the mitzvot, v'chai bahem, we should live and not die by them. Ours is a life-affirming tradition, but that doesn't mean that it's always easy to know where to draw the line, to balance the need for transmission of ancient wisdom and inherited practices with the conditions of any given historical moment. Leaders need to make courageous choices, not for their own self-preservation, self-aggrandizement, or self-advancement. Great leaders make bold choices when they're compassionate, when they celebrate and sustain community, even at the expense of rules that may have previously seemed unbreakable. The Jewish approach to leadership, writes Rabbi Sachs, is thus an unusual combination of realism and idealism. Realism in its acknowledgement that leaders inevitably make mistakes. Idealism in its constant subordination of politics to ethics, power to responsibility, pragmatism to the demands of conscience. As we learn in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud and Tractate Horayot, when our Parsha says, Asher nasi yechata, when a leader fails, it means ashrei, happy. Fortunate is the generation whose leader is willing to bring a sin offering for his mistakes. As Rabbi Harold Kushner writes in his commentary from our own Eitz Chaim Chumash, when the people see the ruler humbling himself to atone for mistakes, they will be more likely to do so themselves. But a leader who denies ever being wrong, who seeks to blame others, will teach people to behave in the same way. The converse of which is, of course, that the risk borne through courageous leadership breeds the reward of followers who are empowered to choose what is right over what is comfortable or what is easy. Shabbat shalom, my friends.